Hello, sir.
Hello, Ankit.
Sir, there is a war of words ensuing between the BJP and the Congress, and this time it relates to India-China relationships. So, Sam Pitroda the other day mentioned that China's threat is an issue that is blown out of proportion. And the BJP responded to it saying the comments were a serious blow to India's identity, diplomacy, and sovereignty. So, without taking sides, I want to understand from you, is China a threat to India?
Way back in 1950, the year in which he died, Sardar Patel wrote to Nehru saying that ultimately in Asia, the main competition will be between India and China for influence and for economic growth and military superiority. We must not ignore the threat. Unfortunately, Indian establishment ignored that threat. They are much too romantic in their notions. The recent evidence suggests that even United States, under John Kennedy, and subsequently, or perhaps even before that, under Eisenhower, repeatedly urged India to be cautious about China, to protect its own interests. But somehow, we believed in good faith. It was an innocent mistake, but a very costly mistake for the country. We believed that China would never pose a threat to India. And if we spend too much money on our defense to protect ourselves, then that will be taking away money from the economic growth project we cannot afford. And we all know what happened in 1962. That was probably the greatest blow to India's morale, national pride, and global prestige. While after that we learned from the past mistakes in terms of defending our territory. In 1969, when there was skirmish in Nathula Pass, etc., India gave China a fitting reply. And subsequently also, despite Chinese superiority in military terms and in economic terms, India has never been found wanting in military terms. We are able to defend our territory and our interests. So to disregard China's potential threat to India would be a mistake. At the same time, to treat China as a perpetual enemy would also be a mistake.
Okay.
I don't think Indian government, Indian establishment, any party, we are treating China as a perpetual enemy. We are on our guard, once bitten, twice shy. And we are protecting our interests. At the same time, we are trading with China. We have a very healthy relationship with China commercially. And China has a huge surplus with India in international trade. And Indian establishment is rightly looking at promoting Chinese investment and other investments in China in our China Plus strategy. And also when America and the West are worried about China as a future threat, and they want to look at supply chains, alternative supply chains, India hopes that we'll get our act together and we'll play an important role. So nothing against China. Chinese people are their civilization. After all, we were parallel civilizations. We have been for 5,000 years. These are two of the continuing civilizations in human history, 5,000 years, with a long history of close bonds. But that is different from our understanding of the Chinese establishment, their own perception of national interests, and therefore their attitude towards India. We must be very cautious. We must protect our interests without making China a permanent enemy, because after all, as I said very wisely, you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors.
Right.
We are neighbors. We are privileged or condemned to be together forever. So we have to figure out a way of coexisting without necessarily impinging on each other's interests and without compromising our own interests.
Sir, how would you judge India's response to the border issues between India and China in 2017 and in 2020 also?
I'm not a strategic expert. I don't want to get into the pissing contest, etc. The fact is, on the one hand, we cannot be mired down in adventurism and a prolonged conflict or an expanded conflict across the whole border or a full-scale war. On the other hand, we have to protect our territory, our sovereignty and integrity, our national unity. And I think it's a very delicate balancing act. I think successive governments have been doing a very good job. It's not about this party or that party. In the face of grave provocation from China, it has a glorious civilization like India. Though Indian civilization is understated, the recent book by Dalrymple, The Golden Road, it shows how we have so much to be proud about our own past, our civilization. But China has a great civilization. Nobody can deny that. Now, if we do not understand that we have to coexist and we have to have long-term friendship ultimately, but that friendship comes from our strength, not from our weakness. Even our potential adversary and competitor respects us only when we are strong, both economically and militarily. We are able to protect our interests. If we are namby-pamby as we were in the 1950s and 60s, we didn't even know our own national interests. We limit ourselves to giving moral speeches to the rest of the world. The world treats us with a degree of contempt and ridicule. So we had to have pragmatism. And what happened after Mr. P. V. Narasimha Rao opened up the economy, taking advantage of the crisis as an opportunity in 1991, is our diplomacy has completely changed its course. Earlier we were moralizing, we were speech making. We didn't even know what we wanted. We did not really do enough to protect our national interests. Whereas subsequently it's all about national interest. It's all about leveraging our diplomatic strength for economic gain. It's all about winning friends. It's all about gaining influence for the benefit of our country and our people. At the same time, playing a very constructive and positive role across the world in the global community. I think India achieved that despite all the hurdles that we faced.
Right. So now let's talk about the difference in where China and India are placed in the economic arena. Now, India is largely a market-driven economy, but China is a state-led economy.
No.
Okay.
China is a market-driven economy much more than India. China's openness to investment is even greater than in India. At the same time, because the nature of Chinese state and the nature of Communist Party, they also keep track, and everybody knows if push comes to shove, they can step in and control anything at any time. They don't have normative rule of law like us. But it will be wrong to characterize Chinese economy as anything but open. Without that openness, there's no way they could have got such vast investment. There's no way they could have become a global giant in exports and manufacturing. There's no way they could have competed with the rest of the world. And between every country, including Germany. Germany before China was the biggest manufacturer and biggest exporter in the world. Now China, from small to big, is a global trading giant, economic giant. We must not underestimate that. It's market economy. Yes, but with a difference. It's not a complete laissez-faire market economy with government playing no role. The government does have hands-on approach. But at the same time, there is no evidence to suggest that on a day-to-day basis they interfere. If that's the case, investment would not have come, production would not have gone up. If anything, they made it an investment-friendly climate. Their SEZs, we started SEZs before China. Our SEZs are on paper for a long time. And I know by anecdotal evidence of the corruption in registering a company in an SEZ. It's a disgraceful thing. We all pretend that we're doing great things. Oftentimes there are problems. But China, once they opened up and embraced SEZs, they made SEZs the initial driver for economic change. It was the Shenzhen SEZ across the sea with Hong Kong that transformed China. Today, Hong Kong is nothing compared to China. But the starting point was that. The trading zones, free trade zones, SEZ, etc. So it will be wrong to characterize China as anything but a competitive, market-oriented economy, but with unique Chinese characteristics.
Right. So what you're saying is very contrary to the popular perception.
No, I remember 2006 or so, along with 4 other very distinguished Indian citizens, I visited China. It was some kind of a semi-official visit. A former foreign minister of China from 1980 to 87, I think, Huang Hua. He was 92 years old at that time. He was our host in that famous Beijing Tuk restaurant. I playfully asked him. I said, Mr. Hua, will you please take our communist friends to your country and train them? about economic management and national interest. He laughed and said in very simple words, in China, Communist Party is about stability and order. It's not about economic policy. If your communists don't understand that, it's not a good thing for your country, he said. So it will be wrong to characterize China as a controlled economy. Yes, there is always a potential control. But in large part, the manufacturing sector and even services sector, in large part, it is a free economy. But at any time, state can intervene arbitrarily because there's nothing like independent judiciary or independent legislature, nothing of the kind. And there are no constraints of a normal democratic process in open politics. That everybody knows. There's no secrecy there. But if you think that Chinese economic growth and competitiveness in markets across the world is unrelated to their openness and competition within the country, then I think you're mistaken.
So, would it be fair to say that China has achieved their economic growth because of, them having a single party system or a authoritarian system, and we not achieving that because we are a democracy?
I don't buy that argument. I don't buy that argument at all. It's a common perception. True, a noisy democracy, a robust democracy like ours, where there's fierce contestation for power, oftentimes there's a temptation to yield to the short-term demands of the electorate. Feed me today, I don't care about tomorrow. Give me something today. Therefore, short-term individual welfare tends to be dominant. But there's a function of political bankruptcy rather than an irrevocable political necessity. In a country like China, because people are not allowed to protest or people are made to sacrifice the short-term individual gain for the long-term collective good, it's a little easier. So that part I concede.
Okay.
But at the same time, that kind of an approach can lead to also devastating effects. Take Mao Zedong's China. The great leap forward, the misplaced, utterly insane policies led to mass starvation in China and 20 million deaths because of starvation between 1958 and 61. It is probably, outside of formal wartime, the greatest human tragedy in the history of mankind. 20 million people dying of starvation in 3 years' time in one territory, one country. It happened because of authoritarianism. The Cultural Revolution, the country lost about 80 to 90% of the symbols of their civilization, all their artifacts, their cultural heritage. Xi Jinping, as a young person, in 60s, mid-60s, at the height of Cultural Revolution, Xi Jinping must have been how old? I think now he's about 75 or 72, 73. So he must have been about 12, 13, 14, early teenager or something. Because his father, his family was seen to be not following the doctrinaire line of the Chinese Communist Party of that day, he was sent for quote-unquote re-education in a remote rural area. Deng Xiaoping, a stalwart leader by that time, a towering leader, long march veteran, a man roughly on par with Mao Zedong and his colleagues, he was sent for re-education. His son was thrown off the balcony and he was permanently physically debilitated. I can go on and on. Thousands of people lost their lives. So, if you think that authoritarianism will always be a blessing, I think it's a very dangerous fallacy. China was remarkably lucky that they had a Deng Xiaoping, a man almost in the mold of a philosopher king. And he had the courage to own up to the past mistakes of Communist Party in economic management. And he chose a path different from Gorbachev. He felt that economic growth and competition and productivity are more important than the robust democratic norms that we normally understand. Probably history proved him right, as opposed to Russia, which worried about glasnost and openness first, and economy they couldn't manage. And even after 1991, we all remember what happened. It was a disaster. The public sector entities, when they were privatized, it all went into the oligarchy's hands and criminal lumpen elements. So maybe Chinese leadership was wiser. I don't know. I can't say that for sure. But The reason why China progressed was, while there is some advantage of some degree of authoritarianism, where short-term impulses don't crowd out the long-term good of the country, minus that, everything else was rational policy, enlightened policy. Just let me give you some instances. China, even today, is far more decentralized than we can even imagine in our country. More than 50% of the total government expenditure is in the local governments, in the third tier, not even in provinces. And genuinely decisions are made and policies are executed locally. Second, China focused on quality education. Healthcare, not so much better than India, but not so much. In fact, healthcare declined, relatively speaking. But education, world-class school education, they ensured for every single child, rural or urban, up to 8th grade. After 8th grade, you have to pay some amount. But quality education up to 12th grade is assured. Very high quality education, productivity. It's a democratic policy to include everybody in the process of development and wealth creation. To harness human potential is democratic. How can it be authoritarian? Decentralization is democratic. How can it be authoritarian? The third thing, at that time, for instance, when I visited China, Chinese were admiring Indian higher education because they look at the brands like IIT and some of our famous national institutions. It's true that we have done well, but across the board, we all know the deficiencies. Obviously, when they praise Indian education, we would silently listen. I would not contradict them. On a foreign soil, why will I contradict them and then show up my country in bad light? But even by that time, our higher education has substantially collapsed. Our school education has substantially collapsed. Evidence now irrevocably points to that, notwithstanding a few highly branded institutions of great reputation. Bulk of our education is in a very bad shape, for no fault of the people of India or the students of India or the parents of India. But China fixed the problem in the last 20 years. In terms of research, innovation, higher education quality, they're on par with the best in the world today. And they did whatever it took, systematically. It's a democratic approach. And as I said, the market-oriented policies. And then they have mastered the art of allowing meritocratic and technocratic, experienced, tried and tested leadership to rise to the top. In fact, if anything is a threat in China or Chinese future, it is the resurgence of authoritarian tendencies on the part of Xi Jinping, the current leader. Because for about 30 years, Deng's policies prevailed. 10 years, clockwork-like, there was a change of power. Next generation was allowed to come in. And there was an orderly succession. And meritocratic, technocratic, experienced leaders, they rose to the top. So it will be wrong to argue that China achieved anything because of authoritarianism. I actually think that China's rational policies and democratization in many ways is what made it possible. Certainly, underpinning that is authoritarian control of the Communist Party of China. Nobody denies that. But as I said before, the authoritarianism, when it prevailed, it actually did immense damage to China. When rational policies and democratization prevailed, China prospered. I think that's the lesson we should get. Because supposing you come to the silly conclusion that democracy is inimical to growth, which is wrong, I disagree with that. But let's assume, for argument's sake, we come to that conclusion. So what's your conclusion then? You want to take away democracy in India? Is it the right moral choice? Is it the right practical choice? So we must make democracy our strength, not our weakness. If we design it badly, if we don't allow the people to understand their own long-term self-interest, and therefore you fall prey to the short-term temptations to get the vote, it is our failure as leadership, not the failure of our people, the voters, not the failure of democracy. I want to be emphatic about that.
Right. So you talked about the disruptions in the global supply chain and how countries are looking for China plus one strategy. Now, if India were to be a beneficiary of the China plus one strategy, how do you think India could make itself competitive to China's manufacturing sector?
I wish anybody has a definitive answer. I don't think anybody in the world has a definitive answer. Not only India, about any country to compete with China in manufacturing. So let's be more practical. China is the world's factory. China is the world's largest manufacturer. They somehow mastered the art, by hook or crook, of producing reasonable quality goods at the lowest possible cost. Nobody can compete. But let us learn some lessons. First of all, when China embarked on 1978 modernization, they talked about 4 great modernizations, but they talked about 4 consumer needs for the ordinary people. They talked about simple things: a bicycle, a wristwatch for everybody, a sewing machine in every household, a transistor radio. These were the first 4 things they started with.
Okay.
Just look at their imagination. They tried to build the economy bottom upwards. They tried to meet the day-to-day needs of a poor population, struggling population. They tried to inspire them looking at consumer needs at a practical level, accessible to everybody in the country. And these industries grew with the domestic demand itself. Then slowly, they went up the value chain. Initially, they manufactured toys, mostly the town and village enterprises. That was the initial stimulus to Chinese economic growth and manufacturing. They were a very small enterprise with 4, 5, 6 workers, 10 workers, low-end manufacturing like toys and many other things, and then low-end electronic goods and so on. So some very substandard, some slowly improved quality. But they built the economy bottom upwards. Now, a large country like China or India, with our diverse economy and with our global aspirations, cannot focus only on one thing. But we are not adequately focusing on the small, the simple things. Let me give an example. Today, China is about 5 times India's size in terms of dollar GDP, nominal. Purchasing power terms, probably they're about 2.5 times our GDP. But by any standard, they are above us in the value chain and in prosperity, because they started early. We started late, and our progress was halting in economic liberalization, but they was continuous and started early. That's the difference between India and China. We're not doing too badly. China did better, but we're not doing too badly either. But this lag, 78 versus 91, and this very turbulent kind of reform process, not continuous improvement reform, 1 step forwards, 2 steps backwards kind of a reform process, as opposed to very even, very strong reform process in China. These are the 2 differences between China and India. Take government sector. Despite the going up the value chain and becoming the 2nd biggest economy, and in terms of purchasing power parity, the largest economy in the world, China, things have changed a little bit in the last few years because of COVID, post-COVID developments, but otherwise, it reached $325 billion of garment exports. Both countries have the same population, they have 5 times the GDP, and therefore GDP per capita, and they're much higher in the value chain in terms of manufacturing. They produce the same amount of cotton as we produce in India. They have $325 billion exports in garments alone, employing millions upon millions of people, low-end workers, low-skilled, low wages. India, even now, only yesterday or day before yesterday, the Prime Minister made a statement that we reached about 3 lakh crores, 3 trillion basic exports. That means today, it probably accounts for about 35 to 36 billion dollars. Earlier, I used to say 40, 45. We're 1/8, or almost 1/10. Because they knew where to focus, where employment is. So China always did its best to make sure that the growth is inclusive. Without enhancing the productivity of the ordinary people, giving them some basic skills and allowing them to participate in economic activity and growing the small industries for the low-skilled, low-wage people, you cannot bring a very backward, very poor, large country and largely rural country into the modern economy. We singularly failed, even today. 90% of our workers in the unorganized sector. It's not because of democracy. It's because while in the license permit Raj, we always thought about the big industry and big things and IITs. We ignored the school education, we ignored the entrepreneurial zeal of the villages, we ignored the market economy and economic freedom, and competition and choice. Now, we have the same approach in a slightly different way. We only look at a small slice of the population which is globally competitive, which has skills, which is urban, which is networked. It's necessary. I'm all for it. But it's not sufficient. That is the reason why our democracy has become a hurdle to economic growth, because we have not been able to persuade our people, the bulk of our people, that economic growth is for everybody. Therefore, there is no natural constituency, natural majority for economic growth in India. You see the recent spate of elections across the country. Without significant individual short-term welfare, there's almost no chance of getting elected in our country. It's a situation brought about by our decision-making over a period of time, by our neglect of the 90% unorganized sector. There are three numbers which are critical for India: 90% unorganized sector, largest number in the world among the G20 countries, 65% rural, the highest rural population in the world, or lowest level of urbanization in the world among G20 countries, 46% dependent on agriculture even today. It used to be 41 a couple of years ago, now it's 46% on agriculture. Again, the highest dependence on agriculture in the world among G20 countries. Any one number is unique, all three are extraordinary. Therefore, you must focus on that. And then the education, quality school education and skills, small town development, health care, to take us out of poverty, enhance productivity, and remove this pain and this descent into poverty as well as indebtedness in the country. These are all low-hanging fruits. India is uniquely placed. Without spending a rupee extra, we can improve school education outcomes. We are spending a lot of money. With spending just a little bit, 0.5% to a little more, but not even overnight, over a period of 2-3 years, we can enhance it. But wisely spent, we can radically transform healthcare. Even as we grow our big cities, if we allow the small towns to grow by judicious town planning and minimal infrastructure, particularly public transport systems, the rest of it, private sector will come in. There will be natural in situ urbanization, local migration. And a 15,000 rupees wage in a small town is equal to 40 or 50,000 rupees in a big city. The desperation of many migrants who migrate out of necessity and compulsion, out of desperation, not out of choice, to big cities, that will no longer be there. So, you must do a series of things. The things we are doing well, I'm no longer talking about it. For instance, we nailed the lie that India cannot do things as fast as China. When you see the remarkable progress in infrastructure, national highways, 30 kilometers a day, it's a remarkable development. Who would have thought 20, 30 years ago India would reach 30 kilometers a day of national highways? It was unthinkable. National highways have been transformed. UPI, who has shown what the world, we are now the world champions. As the Prime Minister said recently, we missed the first 3 industrial revolutions. The 4th revolution, we can catch up, we can leapfrog, at least in some sectors. UPI is a good example. Our digital welfare system, Aadhaar-based welfare system, is now a model for much of the world. What Nandan Nilekani started, what the NDA government has embraced subsequently and utilized it to the full extent, has become a matter of national pride and tremendous national savings. So that means we can leapfrog if we put our minds to it. So let's not find excuses in democracy or our culture. Every culture has its strengths and its weaknesses. Catherine Mayo, when she wrote Mother India, disparaging India, insulting our culture, our civilization, our society. And there are many things wrong with our society, just as many things wonderful in our society. Mahatma Gandhi, very beautifully, he was very simple in his words, but eloquent in the meaning. He said it's a drain inspector's report. If you look closely enough in a sewer in any society, you will see a lot of ugly things, dirty things. America is no exception, China is no exception, India is no exception. To only focus on that, disparaging another country, or undermining your own morale or self-confidence and self-flagellation, that's not the act of wisdom. Let us look at the great things they achieve and be inspired by them. A good example is simulate and improve, adapt. Let us look at our own strengths, our own accomplishments, and be aware of our own failings. But build up our morale and make things happen. During the Industrial Revolution, the economic growth rate of Britain was only about 1 to 2% per annum. They called it a revolution because after 10,000 years of stagnation, when only agriculture was the economy, and agriculture depended on vagaries of nature. If weather gods were kind, you had enough food to eat. If they were unkind, next year you would be starving to death. So there is no question of sustained economic growth. But once we went to the machine age, the Industrial Revolution transformed it. For the first time in human history, our productivity has consistently gone up. We could produce more no matter what happened to nature. And until this last 30, 40 years, until the post-Second World War world, it's unthinkable that countries could actually attain on a sustained basis 7 or 8% growth rates. It's a new phenomenon. But the East Asian tigers like South Korea, and Japan, the post-Second World War world, Taiwan, Singapore showed it. Now China, a giant, has showed what is possible for 25, 30 years of sustained 8% growth rate. And even India is showing 5, 6%. We can go up to 7 or 8%. And there's a lot of difference between 5, 6% and 8%.
Right.
The effect of compounding is such that in about a decade's time, the difference between a 5% growth and 8% growth at current levels is roughly equal to about $1.6 trillion. $1.6 trillion, $1.8 trillion. $1.8 trillion. We could be in 9 years' time, $8 trillion economy. Instead, at 5% growth, it will be a $6.2 trillion economy. A $1.8 trillion loss of production every year means millions upon millions are not employed. Income loss per capita is 1 lakh rupees. The revenues lost to the governments is about 30 lakh crore rupees per annum. If that money is deployed again for welfare, for infrastructure, for service delivery, again prosperity is built.
Yes.
So what India must now figure out is, how do we, even as we understand the democratic compulsions and constraints, but convert that into strength and sustain close to 8% growth rate. It's possible. It's not easy. It's possible. It's doable. So complaining about where we are relative to China or America is unproductive and very silly. Aspiring for something much bigger and better, taking advantage of the opportunities today through rapid growth, and quickly transforming the situation in our own way is the way forward, and it's possible. It's possible and it's necessary. There is no other choice before us. If we ignore economic growth, if we yield to short-term individual welfare as the predominant way of appeasing the electorate, and if we ignore school education, if we ignore healthcare, if we ignore minimal requirements of land and labor policies to promote economic investment, if we ignore dispute resolution, if everything is Gunda-driven, settlement of disputes, and if you don't allow the small towns to grow so that local in-situ urbanization takes place, these are simple, practical things. They're all well within democracy. Actually, they're very popular. Which family is going to be unhappy if you improve the quality of educational outcomes? The poorest families are spending out of pocket. Which person is going to be unhappy if you improve the education, healthcare access so that without out-of-pocket expenditure, healthcare is now assured? Which poor person will be unhappy if he's given an opportunity to go to a local small town and build a decent income with the family within support system, not dislocated from there, not suffering privations in big cities as a lonely people? So these are politically popular. We must learn to do it because we have lost the capacity to deliver. It is more a state capacity issue, restructuring bureaucracy issue. India requires something like a Doge. India requires complete restructuring of government, making the bureaucracy accountable to people and deliver outcomes. Instead of lamenting about our past failures, we only have to learn lessons from them. And instead of self-flagellation.
Right. Thank you for sharing your perspective today, sir.